Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Sir Desmond, and it is indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I want to thank my honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, for bringing this critical debate to the House. Critical because we are at a cliff edge. This year, this deadliest year, when there are 120 armed conflicts, more than any moment since the Second World War. This year, when nearly 320 million people face acute hunger. This year, with 2024 as the hottest year on record. This year, when the deadly trio of climate, conflict and hunger collide to force the displacement of 123 million people, this government decided to slash the aid budget to the lowest level this century. And after, because of, or in despite of, the US administration's decision to close USAID, cut the foreign assistance budget by 85% and shed 10,000 jobs. This year, we surrendered our global leadership on aid and development under a Labour government. It represents one of the most consequential and devastating decisions of recent years, with long-term consequences for our stability, our security and prosperity, and will cost hundreds of thousands of lives. A mistake both moral and strategic. Strategic because aid is not an actor's charity, as we have heard already. It is a long-term investment in our future, not a cash machine in the sky, but a deposit account from which we withdraw for our own prosperity. There is a reason why some of the most vociferous voices against the cuts are from our former military leaders, in contradiction to the government's attempt to reframe the cut as a choice between defence and development. Instead, they argue the two are mutually supportive. Undermine one and you weaken the other. Or, as former US Defence Secretary Jim Mattis said, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition, ultimately. Short-term decisions with long-term repercussions. Easy now, but so hard further down the line. It costs Britain more in the long run. Because through our development spend, we invest in peace and resilience building. Because we know that when fragile states collapse, they create breeding grounds for extremism and terror, and because we know that preventing wars is cheaper than fighting them. The One campaign highlighted that every dollar invested in conflict prevention saves more than 100 in emergency response. However, funding for the Integrated Security Fund has been reduced by over £130 million this year, leaving vital peace-building efforts without support. Strategically a mistake because aid keeps our borders safe. When we invest in the economic development of a nation, it gives people opportunity and a stake in the success of that nation, and they choose to stay there, rather than compelling them to seek it in Britain by migrating to these shores. As the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world unfolds in Sudan, last year alone, over 2,000 Sudanese nationals crossed the channel on small boats. Strategically a mistake because development spend protects our health and security and the NHS, keeping disease from our shores. Strategically a mistake because development spend creates the conditions for trade and partnership, strengthening economies that become markets for British goods and services and promote growth. Strategically a mistake because development is an investment in our soft power, the global influence that comes from being a trusted partner. When Britain leads on aid and development, our voice carries further in diplomacy and trade and security, and when we withdraw, our influence diminishes. And our adversaries, who watched us jealously, knowing the value of that move in. As we cut our soft power tools, the British Council and the BBC World Service, China and Russia cement their influence across the African continent. Those are the strategic arguments, but the moral arguments are enough alone. The government's projections show UK aid spending falling from £14 billion to around £9 billion by 2027, a near one-third reduction in real terms. And the actual numbers are far worse. In-country donor refugee costs, i.e. asylum accommodation costs, are consuming a fifth of our entire aid budget. What right has the government to spend taxpayers' money, my constituent in Eastern Walton's money, allocated to help the poorest in the world in our own country to balance the inefficiencies of the Home Office? Will the Minister ensure that it follows the International Development Committee recommendations in its approach to value for money report published last week, that formal steps should be taken to cap the ODA the Home Office can use for in-donor refugee costs, including capping those costs at a fixed percentage of total ODA, and a formal formal commitment that unspent ODA funding by other government departments is channelled back into the FCDO. Analysis by Save the Children estimates that the UK aid cuts will leave 55 million of the world's poorest without access to basic resources, 12 million without access to clean water or sanitation, and 2.9 million fewer children in education. This year's cuts to our contribution to Gavi alone will mean 400,000 fewer lives saved. Let me be clear about what this means on the ground. In the DRC, a flagship girls' education programme we supported will close early next year. That means 170,000 children, mostly girls, will lose access to education. And the places mentioned by other members, Yemen, in the DRC, around 27 million people face acute food insecurity and cholera and measles spread unchecked. And in Afghanistan, half the population, 23 million people, require humanitarian assistance. These are unprioritised by the government cuts. I could go on and on. The Liberal Democrats believe that Britain can and must reclaim its leadership on development. We need a clear roadmap to restore the legally enshrined 0.7 aid target. So I ask the Minister, will the government rule out any further cuts and set out a plan to return to 0.7%? And we must embrace the role the US has abandoned as the facilitating and convening power. I urge the government to take up that mantle again, like successive governments have done before, like Prime Ministers from her own party, Blair and Brown, pledging to make poverty history. And before she retorts that those were the good times, I remind her of how the coalition government reached 0.7% for the first time after the financial crash of 2007. These were choices. This government's choice is to follow Boris Johnson, but to cut deeper and join the Conservatives and Reform in a race to the bottom. So I urge the government to retrieve your progressive mantle, reverse these cuts, restore our legally enshrined commitment, and reclaim our leadership on the world stage. Let us make sure that Britain's generosity, our leadership, and our belief in humanity remain not only a lifeline, but a light in our ever-turbulent world.
Yeah.